Parents of abducted Kaduna State Greenfield varsity students in Nigeria are apprehensive as abductors have cut means of communications with them. They have therefore intensified calls on the government to help secure their release. The parents took to the streets of Kaduna calling for help on the release of their children who have been held for more than 3 weeks. They've already paid more than 60 million naira to the kidnappers and say they have exhausted all options. Well, joining us now to speak on the impact serial abductions in the country have had on education is Associate Professor at BAZE University, Dr. Abiodun Adeniyi. Good morning, Dr. Adeniyi. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Adefemi and Oji.
Great. Well, now that the Greenfield varsity kidnappers have decided to cut further communications with the parents, and having seen multiple patterns of these kidnappings, in your assessment, what could be the possible reason for their action at this point? They initially demanded 800 million naira for their release when they held 22 of the students captive. They have killed 5 of the students and have threatened on multiple occasions to kill the remaining students if the parents refuse to heed to their demands. As of the communication last time, they wanted, I believe, 10 million naira each for the students, right? I mean, what can be done at this point?
It's a tough one, Oji and Adefemi. Very unfortunate that we have come to this low, and of course we know that we are dealing with a set of nihilists, supposedly a faction of Boko Haram, people who have no human life, and of course they are cashing in on the totalitarianism, on the problematics of our economy, to do what they are doing. Very unfortunate, really. But what we need to do ordinarily in a kind of situation like this, I mean, to deploy kinetic, forceful energy to deal with people like this, because we're dealing with high stakes, perverseness, and what you do in that situation is just to use force, But we have also been bemoaning the failure of our intelligence, because these people are not existing in space. People have been communicating with them. Even the media has communicated with them as well. Even the name has been identified as a leader of the group. And of course, they have taken us through this circle in the last couple of days or weeks. So it just tells us that something is wrong with our intelligence. And other than praying with the parents, who are just waiting now, almost helpless, almost helpless, looking on to the federal government that seems not to know what to do as well, or the security agencies, that seems to be delaying on what they have to do. Other than praying, I actually wonder what else we have to do, besides calling and reinforcing or reiterating our calls on the federal government to act as fast as possible, to preserve the lives of these young and promising students, as the case could be.
Absolutely. I mean, when we cast our minds back to the Chibok and the Dapchi kidnappings, it was clear that the whole point of those atrocities were ideological. Boko Haram doesn't believe in Western education, definitely doesn't believe in the education of young girls. So we could see where the two worlds collided. Over time, though, it seems as though more kidnappers, bandits as they're called nowadays, are having a different sort of motivation. It does look as though kidnappings for ransom seem to be the main cause for a lot of these kidnappings. So at this point, why do you think it is that children, even before I get there, as I said, there's been 2 different types of ideological reasons for these kidnappings. And then you've got the likes of Sheikh Ahmed Gumi, who says that kidnappings, for example, are the lesser of evils, but an evil nevertheless. And I want to ask you, Dr. Abiodun, why it is that at this point, children or schools are still so easy to these types of, so it's still so easy for them to remain successful targets for these people.
Yeah, absolutely, Adefemi. I think, before a criminal, goes ahead to commit crime, he will first of all think about his exit. If he cannot exit a crime scene as quickly as possible, he's not likely to embark on that mission. So they too are thinking people. They too wants to survive. Even the nihilistic terrorists sometimes think of survival, even though he's not ordinarily not afraid of death, as is often claimed. But if it is possible, they would not mind surviving, after their crime, after their criminal act. So the basic thing they think about is, how will I exit? How will I escape? And soft targets are usually their prime targets, because they are vulnerable. They look for schools that are less secured, schools that are in distant places, isolated places. They look for deindustrialized places, villages that are hardly inhabited, hamlets with one or two huts, a few people living in those places, and of course they know that if they strike, or if they strike in those places, it will take time before they are apprehended, or before the world know about it. So it's just convenient for them to target these kinds of places. Of course, we know that they wouldn't go to a military barracks, or a police, or a military barracks for that matter, places where they will be dealt with, markedly. They will avoid those places, and that's why we've been concerned about increasing our level of intelligence around these vulnerable places. The times we are in are unusual at times. Should we continue to leave these places, unmanned? Do we need to relocate the schools for now? Until such a time where we have relative peace in the country? Or do we need to increase, the security around them? Do we have to deploy technology around those places? Or do we have to reintegrate the students into some other schools in more urbanized, more protected places? Those are the things that I think we need to be thinking about around this time, because kidnapping is becoming it's a very lucrative thing. The bandits are cashing in on the lucrativeness to perpetrate the act, and of course, because life is highly valued, God forbid if anybody's word is involved, you want to go for broke to see that it's released. And going for broke simply means that you are closing your bank accounts, to pay off. To pay them off so that you can let your word be. So it's a catch-22 situation between the rock and the hard place, the difficult thing, but the onus is back to the government to be much more helpful, in ramping up security around these schools, around the vulnerable schools, or relocating the students as they have been thinking, or more importantly, ramping up intelligence, so that we can preempt these criminal acts from happening.
Yes, ramping up intelligence. I want to take you on that. You had mentioned earlier that there was a leader. His name is Sani Idris Jalingo in this case. He was interviewed on the Voice of America on May 3rd, I believe. He described himself as a food seeker and not a bandit, right? So these bandits, they've had multiple means of communication with the media and the parents. You would think that our security agencies by now would explore that technology and intelligence that you've just mentioned to fish out these bandits. Now, how difficult can it be, Dr. Adeni?
It actually beggars belief, that we are still in this situation after all those hints, all those kickers. We have more than enough really to leverage on to deal with, apprehend these fellows. And that's why some people suspect some level of complicity, maybe not at the highest level, but at some levels, through because of prospective opportunity, because the opportunity of someone benefiting somewhere. And it's just unbelievable, highly unthinkable that in the 21st century, a Nigerian security network cannot deal with somebody who is already communicating with a section of the press, somebody who parents have been communicating with, somebody, who has obviously received some monies from what the parents have said. So what's actually wrong? And that's why we need explanation. Or if we're not going to get explanation because their security matters, let us see action, let us see results. It's not enough for us to be be told stories about efforts. We need result. And the result we want now is freedom for the students, so that at the end of the day, we can begin to analyze, how they were released, what happened and what did not happen, and probably make arrangements to prevent such from happening in the future, if our networks are perfected or even improved. And I don't believe that these things are too difficult, to achieve in modern times, given the increased sophistication of technologies of communication or technologies of apprehending crime and criminal acts. We see it around the world, and it's just very unfortunate why we cannot see it happening around us, despite all the resources, that we have devoted or committed, to tackling crime in the last 12 years since the outbreak of Boko Haram, and now snowballing into kidnapping, into banditry, into some other things as well. It's just a time we sit up and do the right things, in terms of managing our security.
We'll have to go on a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue on this conversation. Do stay with us.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still joined by Dr. Abiodun Adeni of BAZE University. He joins us from Abuja. Thank you for staying with us through that break there. I wanted to ask you, I'm sure you're well aware that as it stands, some 10.5 million out of school, there are 10.5 million out of school children in this country. More than 69% of those children come from the north, and that's because of, in addition to poverty, cultural reasons. But when we add this recent issue of kidnappings, we can see why that contributes to those ghastly numbers. But even on top of the issue of kidnappings, there's also the gaps in schooling as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns associated with it. So when you have all of these children out of school already, compound these issues like kidnapping and COVID-19 lockdowns and closure of schools, is the Nigerian education system not on the verge of collapse if it hasn't already collapsed?
Well, it's very unfortunate, Adefemi, and we've just had these things snowballing, and we have a multiplication of complexities, so to say. But it's a challenge that I don't think all hopes should be lost. A lot of things can still be done. If we're serious, if the elites are serious, if there's a higher level of seriousness on the part of officialdom, and if we can just go a step further by declaring some levels of emergency in some of our sectors. And one of the critical sectors where we need that kind of emergency is education, because we'll know the role that education plays, for human capacity development, for the stabilization of a system, for the transference of knowledge, of information between one generation to the other, and for the triggering of development, not just for the present generation, but for the future. And of course, that rests entirely, squarely, in the hands of the younger ones, because they form the fulcrum of what the next generation is going to be. And of course, we cannot afford to waste that fulcrum, as the case could be. But so what do we do in the circumstance where we have a problem? But how much are we committing to education, on an annual basis? Is the less than 10% of our budget that we commit to education enough? Then are the interventions of UBEC, of TED Fund, also enough? I don't think they are actually enough. If they are enough, of course, we will not be having agitation, from sections of our higher institutions, unions, labor unions, that is. We will not be having it. So we need some much more orientation, proper policy orientation towards changing the narrative around out-of-school children, the increasing number of out-of-school children. And it's not really a question of culture as well, because all cultures favor one kind of education or the other. But the situation we have in our hands now is that no kind of education is actually taking place because of insecurity. So that question has to be resolved as well. But largely it seems there's some lethargy, there's some reluctance, perhaps because of the convolutions in the system. But that convolution, that cumbersomeness also needs resolving. So that we can can deal with the problems headlong. And how do we deal with it? Of course, we've been talking about it. We were mentioning it earlier. Make sure the schools are secured. And if they are not, if the schools are in distant, remote areas where they are vulnerable, why don't you move the students into a cluster in urban, more secured areas, so that they can get the basic education that they need. Remembering that education itself flourish, in an atmosphere of peace, in an atmosphere of predictability, because it has to do with the brain and the senses, and those organs, of course, need space, and orderliness to function, But our situation is presently antithetical to the smooth functioning of this process, which our government has to resolve, as the case could be, Adefemi and Oji.
Right. Dr. Adeni, I'd like your reaction to the governor of Kaduna State, Nasir El-Rufai, who has openly rejected the payment of ransom to bandits. 2 weeks ago, he declared that Kaduna was at war. He said the government had planned to attack the terrorists who kidnapped the Afaka students in the state, even if it meant losing some of the students in the process, and that the loss of lives of those students would only be collateral damage and the price he would be willing to pay instead of paying ransom. I'd like your reaction to his, state of mind.
All right.
With
yeah, that's right. But whether we like it or not, or whether anybody likes it or not, Governor El-Rufai is one of the few governors in this country that is very forthright. They speak their minds irrespective of whose ox is God. They are not afraid of taking positions and being definitive on policy issues. And I commend him always for that. Sometimes it's not about pandering to the gallery or just saying what people want to hear. That's not what leadership requires. Leadership is about being forthright, being definitive, and whether or not the populace may not like it, at the end of the day, if you're justified on the ground on which you're standing, you might be exonerated, and you might just become an exemplar, an example for future policy decisions and policy directions. Yes, it is very painful in the circumstance we are in for him to have spoken like that, to say that, okay, I'm not going to pay ransom. But of course, we know what ransom does. Ransom, funding the bandits, fuels the action, like somebody once put it. If we keep paying ransom, of course, we know we're encouraging it. But the unfortunate aspect of this is that if government is not paying, of course, the parents, the guardian of victims are also paying. Perhaps what we can do in this circumstance is to maybe plead with the governor or get the governor to look for an alternative way, to resolve the crisis, other than continuous insistence on not paying ransoms. Okay, if we're not paying ransom, what else are we going to do? Right. Are we dialoguing with the bandits? Is there a form of negotiation that we can carry out as an alternative, to cash payment? Perhaps those are the avenues I would expect the governor to begin to look into going forward, because it seems that Kaduna has become the hotbed of these kidnappings and these acts of banditry.
Understood. I mean, going back to the wider issue of keeping children safe in schools, talking about the educational sector, we know that the Safe Schools initiative was launched with much fanfare back in 2014, and that was, of course, because of the immediate attention people had because of the kidnappings of the schoolgirls in Chibok by Boko Haram. It definitely had a promising start. Tens of millions of dollars was donated. There was definitely a coalition between the government here in Nigeria, international donors, as well as Nigerian business leaders. However, in amongst all of that fanfare, all of that money, all of that cooperation, there was supposed to be a plan that came out to relocate students in high-risk areas, create strategies that would strengthen education in camps for internally displaced people. All of these years later, I wanted to ask you your opinion on how impactful that initiative, the Safe Schools initiative, has been since its inception.
Well, for me, I think you captured it. Hello? Yeah, I think you captured it brilliantly. It just tells us once more, the fact that we're a nation where we have different shades, different manifestations of policy inconsistency, and everything is often reduced to politicking because it was probably the idea or the initiative of a previous administration. My administration would give less or no concern to it. That's the mindset we'd always have, forgetting that government and governance should be a continuum. But that was a very fantastic initiative. If we had had it working, if it had been well implemented, the level of kidnapping, banditry, or assault in our schools would probably not be the case now. And do not forget, like you rightly said, funds were allocated for these, donations were made. But again, if you have to begin to go into that now, you have to belabor EFCC and ICPC once more. So that's the nature of our system, which is highly regrettable. Fantastic policies, fantastic ideas and initiatives, but we are often short when it comes to implementation or execution. And again, I remember in the period of Obasanjo, there was this policy about service delivery. Did we continue with that as well? And we know what service delivery means. Did we continue with that? Oftentimes we just come up with this initiative, but we fail to, unfortunately, to execute them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeniyi, for joining us on this segment.